For many of you, good morning, some good afternoon. Here in Brussels, it's late afternoon. Thank you for joining us here in Brussels in the Royal Academy. My name is Bart Verschaffel. I'm chairman of the section of the arts of the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium. And I have the pleasure of opening this event, an event that we have been looking for. Our program is as follows. I will briefly introduce the speakers and then give the floor to Omar Khalif and Tom Mitchell. And they will have a conversation for about an hour. Then we will have a question and answer session for half an hour, which will be chaired by my colleague, Professor Hilde van Gelder, who is Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at the University of Louvain. So let me introduce our speakers for this event. Omar Khalif is a well-known art critic and theoretician, curator, documentary filmmaker. He wrote remarkable books such as Vision, Memory and Media, 2010, You Are Here, Art After the Internet, 2014, and our Goodbye World, Looking at Art in the Digital Age in 2018. He worked as a curator worldwide. He's known for his work he is known for his work in Whitechapel Gallery. He is currently senior curator at Saria Art Foundation, has been teaching in many universities and art schools in Europe and in the United States. We are very glad and proud that he is with us today and that he agreed to make this conversation with Tom Mitchell. Tom Mitchell, who, as you know, is the invited thinker for the Thinkers program on image theory of the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium. Professor Mitchell has been teaching English and art history at the University of Chicago. He is the editor of Critical Inquiry and one of the most important writers in the field of image theory today, with outstanding monographs such as Iconology, What Do Pictures Want, and many more. Today, however, Tom Mitchell has invited Omar Khalif for a conversation starting from his latest book, Mental Traveler, A Father, a Son, and a Journey Through Schizophrenia. A book basically about the enigma, the mystery of human consciousness, or of what the human mind is, of what we are. Omar, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So today's conversation is entitled Madness, Cinema, and the Panopticon. I used to believe that I was little, but now I'm big. I used to believe that 10 times 25 was 60, but now I know that it's 15,000. Wait, no, I just remembered. It's really 250. I used to think the biggest number was 1,000. And now I know that the biggest number that any human being has known is Googleplex. You can never imagine how long it would take to write it down. It would take so long if you wanted to write Googleplex. It's like a quadrillion. So if you have to say quadrillion, a quadrillion times, but you only have to write it down just once. That is an excerpt from the poem What I Used to Think, May 27th, 2020, by Ilan Gabriel Sher, from a personal project of his entitled A Pandemic of Poetry. This surrealist slice of reality is offered by W.J.T. Mitchell's 9-year-old grandson, or at least I believe him to be 9 years old. A collaborative effort between the two, offered during the course of lockdown, transcribed by Baba from Zoom conversations that took place between California and Chicago. So now I turn my attention to our thinker in residence, William John Thomas Mitchell. It is an honor to be in your presence. And I thank you all at the Royal Flemish Academy for inviting me not only to speak with Professor Mitchell, but also to honor the impact that his thinking and writing has had on all of us. As we prepared for this event, I jokingly professed that I would be doing my best Oprah Winfrey today, because I felt it would be appropriate to invoke a healing iconoclastic figure for this conversation, an individual who is also, like Professor Mitchell, synonymous with the city of Chicago. But in reality, William John Thomas Mitchell has always played the Oprah in this relationship. I came to know of Tom's work, and that is how I shall refer to him mostly for the rest of this evening, while studying at the University of Glasgow, thanks to some early training in semiotics. But it was not until I began writing the first chapters of my doctoral thesis in late 2012 that the late Jean Fisher, my closest of mentors, came to inform me of the publication of a new book that Tom had offered called Seeing Through Race, based on a series of iconic lectures that he had given. The word iconic shall resurface often during this conversation. After all, I am sitting with the godfather of icons. In this treatise on race, Mitchell argued against the covert politics of colorblindness, stressing that color, indeed difference, is not only what gives us the clarity to understand our social reality, but that being aware of these differences enables us with both the fluency and the tactics to address and tackle racism. I was particularly moved by the correlations drawn in Tom's cross-section of examples, which looked at color from both an ideological, religious, and ethnic perspective. Seeing Through Race is an apt segue to Tom's most recent book, his memoir, Mental Traveler, A Father, a Son, and a Journey Through Schizophrenia. As the title suggests, the book tells the story of Mitchell's relationship with his son, Gabriel, a filmmaker who struggled with what was diagnosed as schizophrenia. In the first pages of the book, Mitchell notes, "I have tried to see through Gabe's madness." In a sense, one can argue, just as Mitchell had looked through the lens of critical race and ethnic theory, here he is also looking through, or indeed looking past, the language of quote unquote mental illness in order to offer the reader an interior perspective. Initially conceived as an atlas of madness inspired by the likes of Abby Warburg, the results came out very differently. Tom Mitchell professes at the beginning that this is not a book that I wanted to write. It was a book that I had to write. I have implored Tom, or begged him, or professed that he should never write a book again unless he feels that indeed he has to write it. What Tom has produced is no self-pitying diatribe against mental illness, schizophrenia, or the medical industrial complex. It is an animate biography of its subject's creative obsessions with cinema. From the opening pages, we find ourselves immersed in the lush texture of Gabriel Mitchell's visual affinities. It is like sitting in front of a large Technicolor screen at a drive-through, watching Goya and Blake come alive next to Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or sitting in the back seat behind Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz in Cameron Crowe's Vanilla Sky, as they are about to freewheel off of this earth. Godard and Kubrick also occupy this transversal space, one that is imbued with anecdotes of the freewheeling 60s and 70s, while Janis was creating wild vocal settings to Wallace Stevens' Emperor of Ice Cream. Janis Mitchell, Gabriel's mother and Tom's partner, an icon in her own right, is also represented in the book with a selection of tender poems that capture the prickly peaks and troughs of grieving. For die-hard academics, do not be disappointed. There is much to learn and glean from the perspectives offered here. But Tom's book also offers a gateway for anyone who has experienced depression, grief, or loss. It is my belief that this book sits up there with some of the most moving accounts of depression. On my shelf, it sits next to Roland Barthes' Mourning Diary from 1978, Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking from 2005, William Styrone's Darkness Visible from 1990, Susanna Kayson's Girl Interrupted from 1993, and Kay Redfield Jamison's An Unquiet Mind from 1995. When I moved back to the United States as an adult, settling in Chicago for the 3 years I would end up living there, the first person that I reached out to was Tom. I had not known of Gabriel's suicide at that point, and it was not mentioned at our initial lunch at UFC's Hyde Park campus. Living alone on the 40th floor of someone else's apartment in a skyscraper overlooking Lake Michigan felt like the thing to do as a recent transplant to the home of the skyscraper. I was here to experience the panopticon. But quickly the walls begun to cave in on me. The bitter chill of sub-zero temperatures inched up and through my body. The quiver from the biting cold literally turned me to ice. One morning on that initial winter, something unusual happened. I recall being transfixed by the floating rings of frozen ice on the water of the lake when I literally felt like my mind had jolted out of place. I remember crying, attempting to pick up the metaphorical pieces of me off of the floor. Soon began a slow descent into an abyss. Foucault and Freud could not help me here. In one of my darkest hours, my friend, the artist Zachary Cahill, a former student of Tom's, informed me of what had happened to Tom and Janice's son, Gabe. I fought to reach out. Maybe there could be healing by proxy. I took Tom out to lunch one weekend. It was a Mexican restaurant, if I recall. I remember that we sat side by side on a very large family table. Our positioning caused me great unease and irritation. I tried to broach the topic of Gabe's death. I wanted Tom to tell me that suicide was bad, but at the time, Tom did not deflect to his own experience. He asked me why I seemed so troubled. I listed out various diagnostic criteria offered to me by 3 different psychiatrists from the DSM, all of which I did not agree with. I cannot remember the specifics after that. The landscape inside of my head had turned into a cacophonic sonic vortex of screeching electronic noises. I was unable to focus. I spoke quickly. This meeting, this encounter, this was a failure. It wasn't until Tom put his hand over mine to perhaps offer comfort or calm me down that I took a breath. From that day onwards, Tom informally became my Baba, what we call our fathers in Arabic, or our grandparents in many other languages and cultures. He might not want to be my Baba, but he'll occupy that space nonetheless. I have since descended and moved around the contoured shapes of madness from the inside. Reading Tom's book was a suturing, a healing act for me, for too many reasons to list here. Gabriel Mitchell may not be with us anymore, but I believe that his father has done him proud. Reflecting on Gabriel's life now, I personally do not believe that he had intended to take his own life. I choose to believe that, like Tom Cruise in Vanilla Sky, he thought that his descent would give him the power of new life, to start again, to open his eyes. With this book, William John Thomas Mitchell has opened a new page for his son Gabriel, but also for so many of us who have suffered, and who at this moment in the midst of the global pandemic may be suffering more acutely than before. His book situates him as a caregiver of the highest order. Thank you. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Omar. I just want you to keep on going.
It's always nice to be able to introduce someone that you like so much. You know, usually you don't have.
Can I just say that the feeling is mutual, and I only have one correction to everything you just said, and that is that my grandson, who I am told is watching us now, and he's in Los Angeles, and he is 7 years old, and here is his book, his first publication. It is A Pandemic of Poetry. It was assembled by his daddy, my son-in-law, Shlomo Sher, his father. And here is the first page. We spent the first 3 months of the pandemic, from basically March, April, May, into June, 2 or 3 times a week, composing poetry together. I was just the secretary. I took down what he dictated, but this is his dedication page. And it shows the two of us as worms inside of a book. We discovered that we are both bookworms, and we're very happy in our environment. You can see that I'm totally buried inside them.
I sincerely apologize to you, Ilan, for you are obviously much more of a genius than I had assumed. Being 7 years old and able to produce such incredible lyrical poetry is a gift. The gift of storytelling seems to be one that runs through your bloodline, Tom. I thought that maybe we could begin by discussing some semantic things. You know, obviously you're a master of words, and really, can you take us through what you believe to be the appropriate definition of madness as it relates to everyday life? And by that I mean madness as a construct of a lived experience, as a result of a lived experience, as opposed to a construct of scientific study or, for example, critical or cinematic imaginary.
Okay, I'll do my best. In fact, this is the sequel to Mental Traveler is going to be a book called Seeing Through Madness, which will try to do this. I think the best way to do this is just to visualize a very simple Venn diagram with a small circle inside of a much larger circle whose boundaries are uncertain. The small circle is what I would call the sphere of mental illness. It's mainly focused on individuals, behavior, symptoms, sometimes the stigma that goes with it. And the authoritative book on this is the DSM, the Psychiatric Manual of Mental Disorders, with all its numbered paragraphs, a huge vocabulary to try to differentiate the names of the disorders that flesh is heir to. It has gone through now, I think it's in its 6th edition. It's now as big as the Manhattan Telephone Book because the number of syndromes is expanding rapidly. It's also one of the things about the history of the DSM. The first edition, shortly after World War II, was quite slim, and it included now obsolete syndromes. Homosexuality was listed in it as a form of inversion. Hysteria was crucial. Those are no longer in the edition. The kind of thing I'm interested in is what you might call all of the obsolete things that precede the DSM, the history of madness. And one of our interlocutors here who has made a film about madness called A Long History of Madness, Mika Ball, is here with us. And I'm sure she could help us understand why that big circle of madness is so large. That's where lunacy, hysteria, the craziness, all of the vernacular terms of madness, which go on forever and which have long history in every language on the planet. That's what I would call the cultural and symbolic manual, the panopticon of madness, much larger than the DSM and much less open to technical understanding or mastery. In fact, Gabriel's inspiration to me was to say, Dad, I want to turn schizophrenia from this exception into a kind of framework for seeing human nature itself. That is, instead of calling our species Homo sapiens, perhaps we should think of our species commonality is centered on things like emotionality, irrationality, depression, mania, the ability to see what is not there. Sometimes the inability to see what is there because so much has overwhelmed us in our mental life. So in other words, the priest Rue in the great play Marat Sade, who says man is the mad animal, I think is the new kind of fundamental postulate that I'm going to have to explore. That madness is built into human nature, not some kind of deviation from it.
I'd like to return to Gabe's comment a little bit later as well, because I think it's very prescient to this conversation. But seeing that you brought up this project, Seeing Through Madness, I'm curious, as you have articulated, it's a much more expansive field of discourse with many accented and linguistic subjectivities tethered to it, and it's as much about perception and visuality and representation. And you mentioned that the DSM, which I only have DSM-5, I didn't know that there was a DSM-6, but the DSM is already, this big. So how then will you create your selective criteria to create this Atlas of Madness, or this to address this topic then?
The criteria are informal. This is not a scientific investigation. It starts basically from my own experience as a caregiver to a very bright and lovable young man who suffered from schizophrenia for 20 years. So I work out from that center. Gabriel remains the kind of pivot point that launched the book. But one of the chapters is about the question of gifted schizophrenia, which is a kind of rare condition. Most people who suffer from schizophrenia don't report back. They often disappear into catatonia, because their interior mental life is so overwhelmingly complex, sometimes horrifying, sometimes ecstatic, that they can't articulate it. Judge Schraber, for instance, who I have been reading compulsively, had such an incredible interior life that for most people, all he did was sit in the garden and refused to recognize anybody who arrived, because he had to keep the universe stable and pay attention to the butterflies, which were the spirits circulating around him. we are very lucky. Schreber emerged from this and revealed his secret. He said, I was chosen to be the Virgin Mary of a new human species. He had fantasies of transsexuality in which he would be impregnated and deliver the new Adam or Eve for a new start for the species. He was a brilliant man. The fantasies were endless, but he was just one case of something I think that has afflicted a number of where I started. William Blake, who from childhood saw angels in trees and heard voices, and took his poems by dictation, all the way down to Ellen Sachs, or the great inspiration for us art historians, Abby Warburg, whose Builder Atlas was a kind of therapy and perhaps a kind of symptom of his need to understand all of the passions of the human species in a new way. So it's not a systematic exploration. It's more, I would call it more cinematic, exploring scenes, individuals, cases, and crucial to it, it isn't just about individuals. Gabriel, one of Gabriel's insights in his film, his pilot film, for the big encyclopedic film on madness he planned, it was going to be about collective forms of madness, how groups go crazy together, how they reinforce each other's lunacy, their delusions, so forth. And since we are living in a period in this country, anyway, in Europe, the home of the Enlightenment, I hope things are somewhat better, but the United States has just emerged from a 4-year period of really dangerous mass insanity, reinforced by media, gaslighting. As we know, one thing about madness, people are very vulnerable to it. Anybody, you or me or anybody who's listening here, could be driven out of their mind. You could do it within a day. Make them stand in the corner. Don't move. Don't speak.
I was actually going to ask you very specifically a bit later about this, but maybe we should talk about it now. Is this idea of seeing madness? And so in the book, you quote Gabriel when he is discussing how he wants to turn mental illness or schizophrenia specifically into a learning tool that can help others in a sense, and that creates the pilot for, and then he goes and creates the pilot for Crazy Talk, which was inspired by his sister Carmen, which was meant to lead to a 9-hour visualization of madness, an atlas of madness of his own, inspired by Godard's Histoire du Cinéma. And but I haven't, in the book, it's very much about the interior and exterior world of his own madness. And actually, this is the first time I've necessarily heard you talk about this kind of collective madness so explicitly, which leads me to a question that I had asked you a couple of days ago, which is, what do you think Gabriel would have made of, for example, movements such as Occupy, which is the subject of one of your books that you co-authored, or, for example, the movements that have surrounded the likes of the Trump campaign and the kind of faction, whatever you want to call them. I don't know if cults is the appropriate word, but organizations such as QAnon and whatnot. I mean, what would he have made of these things? Would he have been able to decipher and be critical of these things as this is in terms of judgment? How do you think he would have responded to these contexts, which you've discussed in your writing?
Well, I don't even have to speculate. On this one, I know because he was still alive when the Occupy movement took place and participated in it along with me. And in Crazy Talk, his pilot film, he focused on what I think of as the kind of rehearsal for the era of Trump, and that is the Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party, this kind of atavistic attempt to reenact the American Revolution in the present, to restore a fantasy of an all-white America. And he latched on to a set of cartoons that recycled the image of the Tea Party through Lewis Carroll and the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. So when you see Crazy Talk, it only lasts for, maybe 10 seconds, but there's a montage of collective madness, of the things that were already happening in 2011, the year before his death, that he was registering and pulling together as the forms of collective madness at that moment. So the arrival of QAnon or of a psychopathic narcissist as president of the United States, a really dangerous person whose own mental illness mirrors that of a very large body of followers. It's becoming clear now that we have just escaped from the grip of a cult. Republicans who voted against or voted for Trump's impeachment are now being shunned by their own families in this country. The headline this morning of one of our Illinois congressmen is his whole family has turned against him. There's something much deeper than politics, ordinary electoral politics going on here, when people can't accept defeat, and democracy itself is clearly in peril.
One thing that is very much part of the public consciousness today is the idea is a kind of recalibration of the language that we use to discuss individuals with certain conditions or individuals from certain identity categories or groups, whether it's something whether it's around gender and sexuality, whether it's a pronoun, for example, whether it's in the case here in Britain where I am presently, there is a big debate around the term BAME, which is used to basically, it's called Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, to talk about individuals, to kind of group individuals together under an umbrella of otherness. And likewise, I think we're slowly inching towards certain kinds of recalibration around definitions of in and around mental health. And for example, there is an increased sense of awareness that individuals can have cohabiting conditions, that individuals can represent certain characteristics of specific conditions for a period in their life that may go away, or that it may be recurrent. But more than that, there's also been this this sense that if you think of, for example, the young Greta Thunberg, who's autistic, and the way that she refers to her autism as a superpower, and the way that has kind of been given all this airtime, one starts to think that, or if we even look back at, for example, the mythology that great artists like Blake and others suffered or struggled with madness, one can potentially see it as a seductive space to be associated with or in. But my concern, I guess my question and my concern, so my question relates to a concern. For many of us, we have fought and campaigned for mental illness to be seen as and acknowledged by certain employers as a form of disability that allows you to take leave, that allows you to be paid for that leave, or to be entitled to certain kinds of benefits. However, my question for you is, do you think that we should let go of the term mental illness, the notion of illness being something that is very much an othering device? Or do you think that if we let go of that, bearing in mind that we live in a neoliberal economic setup, that we would potentially then be subject to losing some of the things that those who have been mentally ill and those that have surrounded them have fought for? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to let go of terms like mental illness, mental disorder, the medicalization of madness has been a double-edged gift. On the one hand, I think it produced an illusion of mastery, that somehow this was going to be just like medicine. It's not just like medicine. It's within medicine. It involves psychopharmacology, involves also the environment in which people live. So mental illness is a real thing. There's no, and I am not trying to romanticize mental illness when I make the suggestion that I think Blake or that Gabriel was onto, which is that we are all mental travelers. We are all, at some moment in our lives, we all go crazy. In fact, we would not be normal if we did not. Think about adolescence, or think about childhood. Part of turning us into self-managing creatures, people who are capable of self-governance, it's a complicated and extended process. It takes a long time for a human animal to be capable of managing their own affairs. So in that sense, we are all mental travelers. Some of us have a much harder road, and of course are subjected to conditions, homelessness, poverty, discrimination, various forms of othering and exile that make life intolerable, that make craziness inevitable. So no, I hear what you're saying about mental illness, and there's in no way is if I have a polemic here, it's not against psychiatry. I am not part of the anti-psychiatry movement, although Gabriel and I read through the literature of anti-psychiatry, particularly people like Goffman, R.D. Laing, not so much Thomas Szasz. Thomas Szasz was the one who said, well, since we cannot see the lesions in the brain, then mental illness is just bad behavior. And Thomas Szasz is my bad anti-psychiatry figure.
I mean, it is interesting, though, what you bring up in the latter part, which is, you mentioned homelessness, which was something that in the first chapter, Gabe says, I need to become homeless. And he's calling you from NYU in his first year as an undergraduate, it's like to be with these people, to support them, I must be with them, I must be like them. But ultimately, that is a reality for many people when, sheer cognizance just disappears at times, or functionality, but it may reappear. But with the stigma that surrounds mental illness, it can often be impossible to seek help. And the stigma of mental illness, I guess, is one that I'm most concerned with, being from the cultural background that I'm from, specifically the religious background, the ethnic background, where even saying the word suicide in many countries that I roam in is illegal to put in print, for example. But bearing that in mind, what do you think could be strategies to end certain kinds of stigma? Of course, the book and is one, but are there other things that we need to do to see through madness, I suppose?
I think there are numerous things we need to do. The first thing I think we need to understand is that our vocation as human beings is one of care and caregiving. Needless to say, ruthless predatory capitalism is bad for your mental health. It produces enormous pockets of poverty. It's now also defiling the planet. At this moment, 4 million Texans have not had power or fresh water or heat for 3 days. And this is partly because Texas thinks that it is the capitalist capital of the fossil fuel industry across the planet. Only problem is all of their turbines shut down all at once. It's so this is much bigger than the mental health community. It's a notion of care for others that is the foundation, for instance, of socialist thought. I confess right now, yes, I'm a socialist. I think at some point, the American experiment is going to have to recognize that being one's brother and sister's keeper was part of the Constitution, the democratic program, not being in a dog-eat-dog race with your brother and sister to see who can be trampled on. So mental health, I think, is a social issue, both at the level of delivery to people who have a mental illness, but at this much larger, in this much larger framework. And democracy itself, when one of the things I've been interested in reading about the history of mental illness and the history of political constitutions is that the Constitution of the United States was designed quite consciously as a mental health document. It was about the separation of powers, the idea that in here, we're not one thing. We are several things that are working together. Schizophrenia is when they don't work together very well. They start to fall apart. But the idea of division of powers between the reasoning, the will, the judgment, that was the foundation of that, the whole structure of that capital we saw under siege on January 6th. It's a striking moment. And the very idea of democracy was under siege in this country that thinks of itself as the great beacon of democracy.
Well, I want to come back to that in a second, actually, because it is relates to a very specific book that I want to ask you about that you've authored. But one thing that comes to mind is, again, stigma exists in so many other fashions, and it's not just about mental illness. Like you say, being a socialist in the United States, because it is so associated with the evil that was communism and the Cold War era, i.e. to be good to thy neighbor, thy brother, is seen as something almost demonic. And it's quite terrifying, actually, to be in a space with someone who literally has the power to call Secret Service agent on you when you say the word socialism, which is very common in the American museum landscape, actually, believe it or not. But the one thing that I thought about you, that I've always thought about you, is that you've always looked to the other side of the coin, as it were. And you were a very good friend with Edward Said, the father of post-colonial theory, as he's often called. And you published an edited text of his in Critical Inquiry, the journal that you were the editor of for many, many years. And I'm curious about, obviously, Said popularized in the late 70s, the use of the term other to relate to post-colonial subjects. But how do you perhaps see the mentally ill patient fitting into a colonial paradigm? Because I see that it's quite a natural fit, or a very useful tool.
I think it's extraordinarily useful to think about mental illness in relation to this long discussion we've had in culture and politics about the issue of alterity, of otherness. Who is the other? What does that make the self? I think mental illness and madness is, in a sense, our final frontier of the question of otherness. One thing, when someone is mentally ill, they immediately are subject not only to, we hope, care, solicitude, support, but also to a stigma. And this happens, Irving Goffman is wonderful on this. He talks about the moral career of the mental patient, how the mental patient becomes othered first by their own family, because their behavior usually is immediately experienced by the family. Oh, they can't get along with us. They're angry all the time. What's wrong with them? So the moment, as Goffman points out, the moment when you then go to the mental health system, the mental patient experiences themselves as being othered. Now I'm no longer normal. I'm no longer, I'm being exiled, expelled from my family, perhaps hospitalized against my will. And the question of, when for someone's own good should they be confined so they don't hurt themselves or hurt somebody else? That's where the law enters into this. So, but the point is, other forms of otherness, say in terms of sexuality or race, they are part of what we call identity politics. Madness is also an identity politics, but one connected very directly to caregiving and to a kind of very labile form of othering or exile. This is why I think it's very important to remember anyone can be driven mad. No one is immune. And that goes for individuals and collectives. So we have to figure out what is our relation to this otherness. And I think the answer is it's in us. It is definitive of us. And we need, so thinking of the mentally ill as other, then connecting that, as you suggest, to Said's the post-colonial project, and the critique of practices of othering, of exile, exclusion, and stigma is critical to it.
I think what you say about care is all fundamental, is that it's also about the willingness for the patient to receive the care, to acknowledge the need that they are part of a care system, and within that space to be able to reciprocate when necessary. And at this juncture in history, it's very clear and very evident that care is what we all need, actually, to survive this moment in history. But I want to ask you a question that has to do with your literary kind of prowess as a memoirist. Could you tell us a little bit about the way you structured and created the tapestry of the book? Because unlike any book of critical theory, it is, you really are in full force storytelling mode with this book. And so how did you create the pacing, the stylization, the choice of the narrative flow, because it's not always linear as well. And so maybe that could be something you could tell us a bit about.
It was very hard. I can report on that because, I've been trained as an academic all my life. I don't know how many of you out there listening to this are also academics, but just try writing without footnotes. Try writing without depending on citations to authorities all the time. This is what Foucault and Lacan and Derrida think, and so therefore that must be right. I had to cut myself loose from all that. But the key was, first, just tell stories. And I didn't know what the story was. I just knew that there were lots of them and they had to be told. I couldn't get them out of my head. The first one I began with was when Gabe was a student, his phone call saying, "Dad, I've discovered the meaning of life." And I said, "Uh-oh." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "I have to become homeless." And I said, "Oh, good. Well, then maybe you should be a social worker because, NYU has a very good program." He said, No, you don't get it. The homeless are the only people who are in touch with the reality of the human condition. Don't you get it? You and Mom, you're bourgeois, you're comfortable. The homeless know what the world really is. And so I need to do that. This was as a freshman, so I talked him out of it with bribes, things like that. So that kind of story is what launched me. And then there were many others. When he was an 11-year-old boy, we went on a field trip into New York and visited Mad Magazine for a day because I was a charter subscriber to Mad. I always felt it was the best early education any boy could have. And many other stories. But that was only the first phase. After I assembled it, it was just a chaotic assembly of stories. I had very wonderful readers. My friend Bill Ayers read it and said, the stories are great, but they need more detail. And he said, think about it like a novelist. And if you can't remember what happened, make up shit. Needless to say, my wife Janice said, don't you dare make up shit. This is supposed to be true and memoir. So we had a struggle over that. I'm sure there are things I elaborated because, as Bill often said to me, don't forget, memory is a motherfucker. You can't trust it. Tell the story and make the story feel real. And then Bill's daughter-in-law, Rachel DeWaskin, terrific novelist, read, I think, the 4th or 5th draft. And she said, everything is here, Tom. It's just all in the wrong order. And I said, well, what am I going to do about that? And she said, I'll tell you what to do. I got the greatest gift an author's ever had. Rachel just said, take this chapter and put it here. It was like moving pieces on a chessboard. She just rearranged the whole thing, said, try it this way. At first I was in despair. I thought, I can't, all my beautiful little transitions are now crap. But she was right. So with a lot of help from friends, I was able to write it. That was really the process.
I mean, it sounds like you had some incredible support there. But as they, having gone to writing school, you still can't teach someone to write. So I still stand by that it's an incredible feat of your and result of your gifts as an author. And I'm hoping that you're going to do the Agatha Christie spy novel or something else, because I hope that the compulsion to continue without footnotes and endnotes, which is, I think, so incredibly challenging for those of us for anyone who's done a PhD basically, or gone to a university. But I wanted to just, before we open up to hand over to our moderator, Hilda, ask you one last question, which really is about more about you as a kind of figure situating your work more wholly. The other day, you told me that iconology was your most popular book, which I was disappointed by because I thought that What Do Pictures Want, which was dedicated to your children, should have been #1 on the list, and that Cloning Terror should come in second. But it's okay. We'll let the public like what they choose to like. But you know, that book is very specifically about what it means to decode images as text and text as images, and lays the foundation for a kind of lifelong commitment to deconstructing the agency of images. And I know that you have been keenly following all forms of media, from RSS feeds and social media, Web 2.0 to the mass media, the news, and so forth, looking at and considering how Black Lives Matter as a movement has been represented in these spaces, and particularly also the storming of the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. The use of body cams, the use of Instagram. Can you talk about how that has inspired or evolved your thinking around the agency of images today? And maybe is there a link to madness in that as well that we could think about?
Yeah, well, I think both images and words are conveyed by media. I don't need to tell you that. And media are technologies. They are subject to drastic innovations, enhancements, enlargements of their power and range, and instantaneous communication. I mean, think about what we're doing right now. This is words and images. We're talking, and we're seeing people from all over the world. They're seeing us in a format that was unthinkable a year ago this time. Nobody would have even tried this. So the media have adapted to this moment, thanks to the Zoom technology. And this is a kind of chronic feature of our time. Since I've been thinking about democracy and communication and mental health together, and since we are still in the grip of something called a pandemic, I kept thinking about why do we call it a pandemic? What does that root word demos mean? And I think demos, as we know, it is the root of democracy. It is the idea of gathered citizens, not just a population, not just the bare life of the human animal, but the qualified life, thinking of Agamben here, of a demos. And we are, I think, in the middle of simultaneously four pandemics. One is the biological, that is most imminent. But there's also one called the infodemic, which is the reign of gaslighting, the reign of lies. We've always had lies, propaganda, mass disinformation, but it has now reached a pandemic proportion, where in the United States, for instance, we used to have what we called mainstream media, and that was the place where you felt like a common truth could be arrived at. No longer the case. The US, the media sphere is radically divided. About 30 to 40% of the population never reads respectable newspapers, never watches mainstream media. In fact, it's all been denounced as fake news. So they are in a reinforcement loop of disinformation and lying, which I think is capable of producing a collective psychosis. This is what I'm calling the infodemic. There's also, of course, the ecodemic, which is impinging on us from every side, which is climate change. And then there are others, but that's, I think technological advances in this case have not simply produced more and better, but also at the same time as more and better and new, things that are quite toxic and we have not figured out how to navigate.
I was going to show a clip of Crazy Talk now, but then I thought maybe we hand over to Hilda and then maybe we could show it at the end of the question so that people have time to ask. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we should give people time. We've talked almost an hour now.
Hilda? Oh, Hilda's on mute.
Hilda, you there? Oh, no, Hilda, you're muted. I'm asking you to unmute.
Ask to unmute. I've asked. It's very funny when you do this is happening in front of all these people.
Oh, yeah, doe maar rustig.
Hilda, we need you to moderate the discussion now.
I'm there. You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, yes, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Omar. This was very, very fascinating. Wonderful discussion. A lot of questions have come in through the chats, and I'll try to bundle them somehow, though I will also need to break them up slightly. But the majority of the questions have to do with the relationship between madness as an individual disease, illness, and the collective phenomenon. Many members of the audience are fascinated by how both came up. So the first question is one by Bart Verschaffel, but I'm phrasing it for him, who is very fascinated by, on the one hand, us living in a so-called culture of rationality, where we are supposed, all of us, to be very intelligent people. And then on the other hand, where you see that we also live in an era of a collective delusion or large-scale stupidity, as Bart was calling it, and how these both are shifting, you know, the culture of rationality to collective delusion. Perhaps could you respond to this discrepancy and how you have experienced this in writing and thinking about madness?
Yeah, it's a very central question politically for our time, I think. I've been reading recently a wonderful book called Dangerous Charisma. You know, there are over 1,000 books now on Trump, but this is the one I think that it's written by a psychiatrist named Gerald Post, who just died back in December. His book advances what he calls a mirror psychosis hypothesis, in which he spent a lot of his career with the CIA actually analyzing authoritarian leaders for the CIA to give the president of the United States some kind of clue. How do you deal with somebody like Saddam Hussein? Well, he did a psychobiography. He created profiles that were extraordinarily useful. He wasn't there to try to cure these people. He was there to assess their what he said was chronic cases of narcissistic personality disorder in charismatic authoritarian leaders. His hypothesis is that there is a mirroring that goes on between collectives and charismatic leaders, and that this can lead to cult adoration, to beliefs. So people will sacrifice themselves, will do anything for the sake of the great leader. Now that's just, you might think of this as the kind of capstone of group psychosis in our time, illustrated in this mirroring between the leader-follower and their relationship. But clearly, this is something that goes all the way down into groups of any size. Families, for instance, clubs, parties, movements. My whole project, I should have mentioned this earlier, but my whole project has been inspired by one remark of Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil, where he says, insanity in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. I used to think that was Nietzsche being kind of ironic, clever, but not totally serious. The older I get, the more I think, no, he really captured a certain truth. That it's clear that one party in my country has really lost its mind. Very dangerous situation. It threatens the whole system of democracy that's evolved around a notion of balancing two parties. What if one party becomes so imbalanced that it doesn't believe in democracy itself anymore? This is the real danger. So the rare is the individual who is declared mentally ill, but the norm, the rule, is the group. That's where the real danger arises.
Yeah, and then it was interesting how Omar connected that to the colonial paradigm. It's fascinating how that came up and the history of imperialism. Do you see, maybe you could elaborate just briefly on potential connection in relation to group delirium in contemporary society?
Well, here's I think this raises the question of rationality itself. The idea that madness is irrationality, I think, is a very dangerous assumption. When we think, for instance, about empires and the way empires treat others, the British Empire regarded itself as an extension of the conquering empire of light and reason, of Europe bringing civilization to the rest of the world with pretty catastrophic consequences for the recipients of all of this rationality. Not I'm saying the world was just fine before empires started to conquer, and usually with highly rationalized military force and bureaucracy. But we've also seen the example of the Third Reich, where famously the trains ran on time, and German engineering, technical inventiveness was at its peak. Science was, made great leaps forward. But in the service of mad projects, extermination, genocide, conquest. So madness and rationality are not opposites. Rationality can be an instrument of a much higher and pervasive madness.
Okay. Yes, and then from there, another person asked a question that's slightly more personal. The question goes as follows: how does society distinguish between bad behavior on one hand and mental illness on the other hand? And how did you experience this as a caregiver? So it's a bit more personal here.
Yeah, that's so hard. That's such a hard question. I think, in the debate about Donald Trump, I know one of the DSM psychiatrists said, stop talking about Donald Trump as being mad. He's bad. That's all there is to it. And I thought, yeah, of course he's right. Because, for instance, calling him mad or saying he's mentally ill, I don't think he is a good subject for caregiving. I don't think he's curable. He's merely manageable. And the idea of cure itself maybe needs to be questioned. This is something Abby Warburg discovered, and I think Gabriel was onto it as well. That is, when you find that you have a mental disorder, that your mind's not quite working the way other people expect it to, the notion of a cure, of suddenly, oh, now I'm okay, now I am normal, can become a kind of phantasm. Abby Warburg, and I think this is a key to the Builder Atlas, the panopticon of emotions, he listened to Binswanger, his favorite therapist, Binswanger, a follower of Freud, who said, I can't cure you, but you can manage your life. You can not be crazy all the time. You can, because when he was in the asylum, Warburg was notable that they said he was completely out of his mind in the mornings, but by tea time, he would calm down, and Ernst Cassirer would come for tea, and they would talk for a couple of hours. Crucial that we realize that when people are crazy, they're not crazy all the time. This is one thing I learned with Gabriel, that it was cyclical. There were good days and bad days. Also, that it depended on the context, that sometimes he could be with a group of strangers and he could work the room like a skilled politician, because he was convinced everyone out there is a mental traveler like me. Everyone has an infinite soul and a path they're on. So he didn't have any patience for small talk. He would immediately come to people and say, so who are you? What is your dream? What are you about? And they would, a lot of people after his passing told us, you know, I only met your son once, but he had this incredible impact on me, because he immediately wanted me to open myself up to him the way he was opening himself up.
Yeah.
Very uncharacteristic of schizophrenia, by the way. And that's why these labels, the DSM, I think, fully acknowledges that the labels are very imprecise, and that the question of time, of cycles, of good days and bad days is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, we should definitely later on, Omar, screen the clip that you have prepared for us and bring the conversation to Gabriel's art. There is also a question, if we can talk a bit more about the book in relation to the title. That brings us closer to talking a bit about art. How to interpret the book's title in relation to Blake's poem? That's, I guess, an obvious question for you, Tom, but it hasn't come up yet today.
Yeah. Well, it's in some ways, I think, Blake's greatest poem. It's not like his big mythological poems full of allegorical figures and invented characters. It's just, I traveled through a land of men and women too, and heard and saw such dreadful things as cold earth wanderers never knew. I can recite a little more of it. For there the babe is born in joy that was begotten in dire woe, just as we reap in joy the fruit which we in bitter tears did sow. The cycle of the seasons and the cycle of reproduction of human life, begetting and birthing, planting the seed, harvesting, all of that is backwards, upside down in this mirror world of the mental traveler. It's as if Blake wanted to hold up a mirror to the human psyche, but in a mirror, everything is reversed. It's both the same and the opposite. So that's what I think, and Gabriel and I, he knew this poem very early. I used to play it to a heavy metal setting on guitar, and so it was one of our favorites. And when I was casting about for a title, I thought that was it, that really the question of of mental health, mental illness, mental disorders. Let's think about it as mental travel, and start with the assumption that we are all mental travelers. This was one. I was very close to him. I learned an immense amount about the world of schizophrenia from him, about his experience of it, and his efforts to make those experiences public, to bring them out. It's the way Schreber did, to say, here's what it's like. It's not your world, but it's a human world. And you may find something of use if you follow me down that path. So that's the title. In a way, it came very late. I didn't know what to call it for a long time. But it seemed to pull the strings together.
Yeah, definitely. So if you situate the book within your larger body of work, do you see it as something very particular, or does it somehow fit and make sense within the rest of your oeuvre that you have written? How do you feel about this when you look back at this wonderful particular book?
Well, as Omar said before, it was a book I didn't expect or want to write. You know, I wanted my son. I didn't want to write a book about my son. I wanted him to make his 9-hour film. But it fit in one sense. Before Gabe took his life in 2012, he had commissioned me as his research assistant for his film, the Histoire de la Folie, that was to be the 9-hour Godard-style epic, showing the entire range of individual, collective madness, the whole planet as a ship of fools. That was the basic metaphor. Since we now know we live on a spaceship Earth, we've discovered that at least since the 1960s. The old ship of fools metaphor has come back in a rather new way. So I was already his research assistant. And the first seminar, which I taught with a psychiatrist here in Chicago, Bernard Rubin, and my dear friend Francoise Meltzer, we taught a seminar just called Seeing Madness, which was mostly film, but also a lot of visual art and medical documentation about the spectacle of madness. Because one of the things that's a paradox, we often say, well, mental illness is invisible. You can't find the lesions in the body. It's just its behavior. There's also this fascination with madness as an object of performance, display. When you think of the genres of theater, of performance, comedy, tragedy, satire, romance. I mean, Greek drama, Shakespeare. You wouldn't have these plays without the madness. That's what drives them. King Lear, probably the most spectacular of all, the mad father, fighting his kingdom.
Yeah. There were quite a few questions also in relation to your research on images and how certain photographs, or the example that was given was the pictures, the iconic pictures of the Tiananmen Square, how they make us see the unthinkable, and how we perceive that then as images of madness. So perhaps you could briefly expand also on that, and maybe even in relation to the Meta Pictures project.
Yeah. One of the books that actually Gabriel volunteered to be my research assistant on was my book about the War on Terror, written in the decade after 9/11. And he went searching for into the archive of the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, particularly the figure of the hooded man and other figures. So his and of course, a prison of that sort not only produced death, but mental damage of all kinds. The hooded man later came forward and revealed that he'd been, hospitalized. He'd had a complete breakdown as a result of the treatment that he received, which wasn't even so much physical abuse as just, deprivation of food and water, occasional threats to his life, constant abuse. So that archive of what the U.S. did when it invaded Iraq and the results of terror. When you think about it, terror is the modern form of psychological warfare. It's not military conquest, doesn't involve invading armies. It involves an emotional attack. You reduce the enemy to helplessness by terrorizing them. So the figures, that's why the book Cloning Terror came out. And Gabriel was very much part of the research for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there have been numerous comments in the chat. So I'm bouncing it a bit back to Omar and Tom now. Do you feel we should open up to, I see that Janice has commented in the chat. I don't know if we should have a few people speak out and then have Omar introduce the clip. How do you feel we can proceed from here?
Why don't we hear from Janice? I'm sure she has something to say. She can correct any mistakes I've made.
Janice feels like speaking to us. Janice Misrael Mitchell.
You can unmute Janice.
Gabriel's mother. But she's not there.
Okay.
Janice, are you there? No.
You can ask, I've asked to unmute her.
Okay, I think I'm on now.
Oh yeah, there you are.
Yeah. I just added what I had to say in the chat, and this was about, what we've been witnessing in the past month or so through the mobs. And I think, and Tom and I have been talking a lot about the religious element in some of the things that are said by people who are still convinced that they must support Trump no matter what. And I guess, and I'm not an expert in any of this, but I've thought a lot about people within crowds, within mobs, and kind of giving in to the mob sensibility. And if it's kind of a long-term thing, I think it does have elements that are similar to embracing ecstatic religion. And this would have to do, the relation to schizophrenia would be the breaking down of the individual barriers and kind of agreeing to go with a group feeling, which then becomes stronger and stronger because the barriers aren't there. And my initial understanding of this was watching the crowds when Hitler was speaking. And you have this huge body of people who have been primed by music and soldiers and rhythms, and then the rhythms of the bodies against each other. And that if you're breaking down barriers and you have this kind of collective energy, that can also result in the kinds of things that we have seen in terms of mobs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay.
Mika Bal also had a comment question. I've unmuted Mika.
I just want to say that I think it is completely wonderful, brilliant to change the terminology from all these DSM terms and I remember once when we showed the film on madness in England to an audience of 200 people from the association Hearing Voices. And that was the Association of Schizophrenics. And it was an incredible experience. And we were very fearful. And in the end, they were very positive and it was very engaging. But to call it mental traveler, I think is genius. It gets rid of the otherness, of the othering. It gets rid of that sort of the frontier establishing around people. and yet it says something. It has content. So, Tom, I really want to compliment you on that term. And as you explained, it was actually Gabe's idea to talk about it in those terms. But I think it is fantastic. And I'm going tomorrow to see the psychoanalyst with whom I made the film. And I'm going to tell her this is the term that we need, because it is dignifying. It is not, it has nothing of the derogatory connotations, and yet it is specific. And it is also something that we all engage in sometimes or others, but it is also specific. I think it is a fantastic term. Thank you, Tom.
Sure. And I could just respond to Mika. Another inspiration for taking that title and that name for madness, mental travel, was R.D. Laing, The Politics of Experience, in which he talked about schizophrenia in two ways. And he said, I'm not talking about this in the mode of psychiatry. He said, I think schizophrenia fundamentally is something like a broken heart, which is the vernacular term. And that was certainly true of Gabriel. May not be something you would generalize, but it often is part of it. The idea that you feel like yourself has been broken by something. Fragment.
I completely see that. But the wonderful thing about the term is that it accommodates that too.
Yes, it does. And it also, that Lang's other comment was, we should think of schizophrenia as a kind of exploration of a frontier,
yes,
like the seafarers of the early 17th century, most of whom never returned to tell their stories. Mm-hmm. But then, and this for me was the entry into the chapter on gifted schizophrenia. The idea that some people who go through this travel come back to tell the story, and we should listen.
Yes, we should. Absolutely.
I wonder, Hilda, if now we should show a clip of Crazy
Yes.
Talk, which was
Omar, I was going to say this will make an excellent transition to the clip, but could you please introduce it briefly to the audience so
well,
everyone
I mean,
has an idea what you will show?
Oh, well, Tom has discussed it already, but it's a couple of times, but we're going to show, well, basically I was saying to Tom, we have to show a clip that Gabe would like. And we started off by saying, should we show the end scene from Vanilla Sky? Because, it's just so magnificent and dramatic and evocative and captured also so well in the book. And then we decided to instead show you a few minutes of Gabriel's Crazy Talk, which is, as Tom mentioned, was the pilot film for this larger 9-hour project exploring a panoptical history of madness, but also it actually the fact that it is on this balcony and situated within the city of Chicago in this specific panoptical way, we felt was an appropriate way to tie things together, but also bring Gabe into the room as well. And for those who don't know, of course, Gabe has been in the room the whole time, also as my background. The cover of the picture that's on the cover of Tom's book, and I just got my hair cut yesterday, self-cut, bad haircut, but I should have probably kept the curls so he and I could have a bit of a curly hair war there, but unfortunately I didn't think about that till today. Should have delayed. But without further ado, I'm gonna technically figure out how to make this happen in 10 seconds. Tom, do you want to do your own, add a few words in while I do this?
I'll just add one word, and that is listen to the soundtrack carefully. This is a choral piece, a setting by Janice Miserel Mitchell, my composer spouse, of Blake's early lyric written when he was a teenager called Mad Song. It's a chorus of, I think, 12 voices.
What mental illness is in reality. And also because I think there's a lot of films that kind of misrepresent it.
Well, it's interesting. Cultures shape the experience of mental illness, whether you talk about depression or something like PTSD. How we think about it and how we treat it actually shapes the experience itself. So when we, as the globalizing culture in America, export our notions of mental illness in terms of how we treat it and how we think about it, we are inadvertently shaping those illnesses as well. And what we are doing by exporting our notions of mental illness around the world is we're homogenizing the way the world goes mad.
What's your name, man? Fred. Nice to meet you, Randy. Nice to meet you as well. Thanks for your generosity.
Who might attack the military here in the United States. This was apparently said to Major Hassan, who it's my understanding is a convert to Islam. Is that right?
You know, there are a lot of people who have been declared crazy at one time or another who later turn out to be rather geniuses or making a contribution that people could not or would accept at the time or would not recognize, but which later turned out to be very substantial. So it's all relative. I mean, it's an easy word to throw around. I suppose I've been called crazy at times too, when people have not accepted an idea or a suggestion that I've made.
I know that psychiatry is a pseudoscience.
Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. What the fella said. Naturally, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly.
Experience a death-like paralysis, together with deep feelings of terror and helplessness. One of our early test subjects described it as being like death, a sense of stifling.
I was gonna end it actually at the moment where the eyes are kept held open, and I had a perfectly timed pitch, but like most things, I don't always achieve them well. I just wanted to make a comment about the first of all, to say that you can watch the entirety of the work as well as of this piece, as well as other of Gabe's works on his website, which I'm just going to put in the chat now. And it's filmworks.com, is that correct? But with a P and an X. And I've just put that in a chat to everybody. But what's so incredible to me about watching this, when I watched this clip, is in a sense the technique that Gabe has used is one of appropriation, of sampling, that has become so rife in the age of the RSS feed, in the age of Instagram, of taking someone else's image, screen grabbing it, editing it, contorting it, and putting it up against another kind of material to create a new form of meaning. And in a sense, the metaphor of appropriation and assimilation of these kind of fragmentary narratives that we now see so often permeating the thickened digital sphere really is an appropriate metaphor for schizophrenia, for madness, as we have discussed it, but also for this this idea that has come out today of the collective madness, because basically everybody is infinitely scrolling through their phones, through these RSS feeds, appropriating, borrowing, and taking stories and making and culling and creating their own stories in this kind of insular mad experience. So I think that in a way, Gabe foreshadowed a cultural moment that very much has kind of been accelerated by the isolation that the pandemic has shown us, with everyone being glued to their phones and their screens as we are now. And there is that moment where I did feel very like, high five when I see, Major Hassan, the Islamic convert, being called the raghead on the news, something that I have been called often in my life, juxtaposed against Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who's one of my favorite kind of anti-hero figures. So I'm sad that I never got to meet Gabe personally, but I do feel that I would have liked to have experienced his what I think is an incredible sense of humor that he must have had. And I wanted to maybe just end off my part here by asking you, Tom, to reflect on, perhaps as a filmmaker, what Gabe's ambitions really were with cinema. From going through, you outlined some of that in the book, but really in terms of where he would have wanted to be today, and maybe even post the 9-hour film.
Yeah, I loved the idea of the Histoire de la Folie. I don't know how many of you have seen Godard's magnificent Histoire du Cinema, which is 9 hours. The reason he took that as a model was we had a kind of film group, a little club, included Tom Gunning, Yuri Sivian, Miriam Hansen, and other friends. And we watched that 9-hour film over 9 weeks, watching 1 hour each week, every Tuesday night, followed by pizza. And then we would watch the same hour again, only we would stop to analyze. So he had an incredible tutorial in montage and the techniques of assembling a huge amount of material. Of course, as you could see from Crazy Talk, he was stealing film footage from everywhere. And when we pointed out to him, I mean, I hate myself for remembering this, but I said, Gabe, there's copyright restrictions on this. And he would look at me and say, Godard gets away with it. He steals from everybody. Why shouldn't I? I should have said, you're right. Go ahead, steal all you want. Let them try to sue you when they find out, that you are working as a grocery clerk and making $100 a week. They'll have a tough time getting anything out of you. Anyway, I thought it was actually quite a brilliant idea, and I encouraged it, even though it was utopian. And I still love Crazy Talk's way of condensing the issues of individual and collective madness together. In a way, it's a 9-minute glimpse into the encyclopedia he wanted to show, particularly when he breaks away from Tom Cruise falling to his own approaching the edge of his building, to reflections on colonialism, and then moves to torture and brainwashing. The scenes from A Clockwork Orange, which is about operant conditioning. So it's a little gem of a film that gives us, I think, a great insight into how he wanted to proceed with this subject. If anybody wants to see it, by the way, the whole thing, just go to Gabe's website, which
we put it in the chat, Tom.
It's in the chat. Okay, it's called filmworks.com, and all of his films are available there on YouTube, and a lot of other things as well, his sculptural and drawing projects and cartoons, and he made a documentary also about our dear friend Bill Ayers. He had Bill read from Fugitive Days, his memoir of going crazy in the late 60s in the anti-war movement as part of Students for Democratic Society and the Weather Underground. And Bill said, yes, of course, we were crazy with revolution. Gabe asked Bill to read the first chapter of his memoir, and then he went out and created a montage of images from newsreels and other records of the 60s. So it's a kind of, it's a tribute to Bill Ayers and another moment of political madness, which us old folks lived through.
Tom and Omar, let me conclude officially at least this marvelous event, and then you can go on afterwards. But I want to thank everybody joining us for this event. I want to thank Hilde for chairing, and of course both of you for this marvelous dialogue. Stay safe, everybody, be well, and now we can just go on talking like you did.